Hey everybody, welcome back. Music Corner, as always. I'm your host, Albert Fish. Just Google it. It's been a while. I spent most of the month of December working on writing, doing some crunching, trying to get in the last reviews of the year, and then obviously writing my year-end lists. It took a lot of time, a lot of hard work, but I'm really happy with the results. I will put a link in the description if you want to see all of the best and most interesting music of 2021. I wrote 7 big lists about it, but the subject of today's video is actually the more provocatively titled 10 albums I was wrong about, and that is a little bit of a grabby title because ultimately I stand by my original reviews of all these records, and I think they're reflective of how I felt about the music at the time. But as you all know, with changing and evolving trends and broadening of each and every one of our musical horizons, it sort of makes some things that you heard in the past change and recontextualize, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. So I took a look back at my reviewing history and I picked out 5 albums I was a bit too critical of, that I enjoy a lot more in retrospect, and 5 albums that I don't think have held up quite as well as I initially felt when I first reviewed them. If the reviews are still available, I will link them in the description. A lot of the older ones are not, but without further ado, let's boogie. Let's absolutely do it. The first record on the list comes to us from Mitsuki with Puberty 2. Now, the hype for this thing from me and from a lot of other people in the indie scene off the back of the spectacular single Your Best American Girl was really through the roof. And I think that's why I came away from this record thinking it was just okay. It wasn't until a few years later when Mitsuki released her follow-up album, Be the Cowboy, that I was like, wow, these songs aren't even finished. They're not even, fully written. They're barely even songs. But people were really going crazy for it, so it made me dive back into the Mitsuki well to maybe see what I was missing. And while I'm an even stronger critic of Be the Cowboy than I was at the time, revisiting Puberty 2 really showed me that Mitsuki knows what she's doing, and there was more here than I originally gave her credit for. There may not be that many moments on the album like the hook of Your Best American Girl that really just knock your socks off, but there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of subtlety, and there's a lot of gorgeous songwriting to be found on Puberty 2. I think this thing is pretty firmly among the 20 or 30 best records of the year, and I didn't sort of rank it that highly at the time. I haven't been crazy about Mitsuki's new singles either, so stay tuned when that album comes out in February. Staying in 2016, the next album on the list is the 1975's I Like It When You Sleep, for You're So Beautiful Yet So Unaware of It. Coming off of their sort of world-conquering pop rock debut self-titled album in 2013, I was really excited to see what Matty Healy and company were going to do next on the sophomore album, and in my defense, or at least me at the time, this thing has some incredible highlights. The song Somebody Else is one of the band's most beloved tracks to this day, and the track Love Me is just an explosive piece of pop rock ecstasy. But it was when you really dive into the details and look between the margins of these great tracks that this 80s flavored pop rock album starts to sort of come apart at the seams, and the 2 1975 albums released since then have really shown exactly what the problem was. They followed this record up with their best and most creative album, A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships, which absolutely nailed it between the margins, with interesting, shorter tracks and 2-part tracks that went beyond just this album's great singles. It did everything right that I Like It When You Sleep did wrong. And then we saw that thesis expanded on and mutated and warped into their most recent album, which featured plenty of great tracks and plenty of not great tracks that really are inexplicably included. So Going forward for the 1975, we're looking for more self-titled, more brief inquiry, because all of their albums have highlights, but man, when they get the little things right, they can do really, really great stuff. Next up on the list, Remo Drive, Greatest Hits. Now, I actually gave this record a pretty good review, and kind of similar to Mitsuki, I was really, really hyped going into it because the song You're Killing Me just absolutely won me over from the very first moment I heard it. And because I was so excited for that record, hearing the rest of this and not being that blown away by anything else may have distracted me from just how interesting and just how creative this record is. But what really did it for me is pretty much everything the band has done since this point, which has bounced between like decent to just mediocre and bad and not good. And even though they've managed to release some more of those incredible, like amazing singles in the meantime, I don't know, nothing they've ever done has come anywhere close to Greatest Hits, which as the years go by continues to sound better and better and better to my ears. At the inverse of that, we have hype derailed in the opposite direction. The Brockhampton album, Saturation 3. Now, it is hard to describe what the Saturation era was like if you weren't there, if you weren't involved. Not like I was there in Texas with the boys. I was just on my silly little computer. But seeing them drop new songs basically every week in the lead up to Saturation 1 and 2, and them hit so perfectly. They were so creative, so versatile, so innovative. It was just a really, really awesome time to get in early on this band. And the hype for Saturation 3 was starting to build up, particularly after the single Boogie came out. And yeah, to this day, there are some people that still consider this to be like their best record and among their best work. And phew. Looking back on this album, I can tell what past me saw in 2017. It follows a very similar formula to what made Saturation 1 and 2 so good, but when you compare it to those records, it falls short in almost every way. The bangers are not nearly as intense. When the band dials it back and gets personal, it is almost never as compelling as it is on their best work. And given that they turned around and continued to make both good bangers and good thought-provoking, emotional, almost indie rock style tracks across their next couple of albums, leading all the way up to Roadrunner last year, it just makes Saturation 3 look more and more like an average okay entry into their catalog, and one that I feel like I just drastically overrated when it first came out. Oh, and next up, Paul McCartney, Egypt Station. Now, if you don't remember this, I'll fill you in as briefly as possible. The lead single to this album is a song called Fuh You, and it is notoriously one of the worst things Paul McCartney has done in his entire career. I would gladly listen to Simply Having a Wonderful Christmas Time for the rest of my life before I had to listen to Fuh You again. But last year I came across a CD copy of Egypt Station, which I had heard had really interesting packaging, so I picked it up, I looked through it, I thought it was really interesting, and I decided that it was time to give the record another shot. And once I got into the details of this little guy, once I got into all of these other 15 tracks that are not Fuh You, I realized that this is actually one of the most interesting records Paul McCartney has released in a long time. And when he followed it up last year, or I guess the year before, with McCartney 3, another album that I found interesting and exciting, it kind of made me realize that he's on a little bit of a creative hot streak, and I'm pretty excited to see what he's going to do next. And I recommend this record to people who are fans of his style of music. And another album I overrated, with yet another long title, the Tune Yards record, I Can Feel You Creep Into My Private Life. This one's a little bit harder to explain because I responded pretty positively to this record even when a lot of other people didn't. I thought it was an enjoyable change of pace for Tune Yards that saw them dialing it back, writing music that was a little bit more reserved, a little bit more reflective, and the results were songs and styles that they had never really dabbled in before, and I was really interested in the way that they were pulling them off here. But last year I ran through the band's entire discography in the lead up to their album Sketchy coming out, and I realized what wasn't clicking with me anymore, and it's almost all of those more low-key, more reserved tracks. There are still some fantastic, fantastic songs on this record, like the criminally underrated Now Is Then, and the lead single, the banger Heart Attack, but it just doesn't have that pop. It doesn't have that shine that you come to a Tune Yards album for. It's certainly the least zany, the least off the wall, and the least unpredictable of all of their records. And I think in the loss of those attributes, they lose some of the replayability and some of the unique elements that make the sounds of Tune Yards so fascinating. Number 4 in the good pile, Kaytranada. Kaytranada? I don't know. It's one of those names that you hear people say both. I'm pretty sure it's Kaytranada, but Kaytranada is what I came up saying as a young, Odd Future Steve Lacy dork, so Baba. Regardless of how you say it, this is a huge change of pace from Kaytranada's extremely acclaimed debut album, still one of my favorite electronic projects of the 2010s, and I think that's what put me and a lot of other people off of it. This is a very stripped back, very accessible dance record. It is just a straight up dance record. A lot of the psychedelia and jazz that Kaytranada was working into his music on his first record doesn't appear here, but when you accept that about the album, there are so many good songs on this thing. Kaytranada's ear for production, for details, for space and texture is still so strong. His sonic vision is still so dynamic, so interesting. Like, for a dance record, these songs are so versatile. They work and groove in different ways. They expel different energies, and the guests are surprisingly persistent throughout in terms of just great hooks, great energy, elevating these songs. There isn't much that I don't like about this album, and even though it is a major dial back in terms of genre, creativity, and ambition, you got to admit that what Kaytranada did here works. It just works. But as one album rises, another shall fall, and that album is the Vampire Weekend album, Father of the Bride. I love Vampire Weekend. I still really enjoy this album. It features some of their best songs. I stand by so many of the notions that I put into my year-end lists. I do think this is one of the better albums of the year. I think Harmony Hall was one of the best songs of the year, as is That Life, as is Sympathy, as is Jerusalem, New York, Berlin. The reason I'm giving this record all of these compliments is because I gave it such a glowing review. Like, you would think this thing was just perfect from the review that I gave it, and it's not. It's a little bloated. That's its biggest sin. There are just songs on this record that are so redundant. Songs that are just weaker, uninspired versions of other better tracks on the album that feel thrown in because it had been so long since we last heard music from Vampire Weekend. So yes, in between, snaking between all of these great songs that made me so happy that the band was back, I was willing to overlook a handful of tracks that just clearly really didn't need to be there. And I think I spent a lot of time listening to the pairs of singles that were being released, and not a whole ton of time sitting down and listening to this entire album as a whole. Because I think if I had done a little bit more of that, I would have realized at the time that, a lot works, but there are some flaws here. There are certainly some tracks that I would cut, and I certainly think there are ways that you could make this a better record and a more fulfilling comeback from the band. The last album that I wish I had given a better review than I did is the most recent One-O-Tricks Point Never album, Magic One-O-Tricks Point Never. With the new Weekend album coming out in just a few days, which One Oh Tricks Point Never apparently had a big hand in sort of executive producing and helping assemble, and it appears to be a radio-themed concept album, you have to wonder, isn't that the thing that One Oh Tricks Point Never just did? Yes, back in 2020, Daniel released this concept album that was sort of a blend of electronica and ambient, a very abstract form of ambient that was meant to simulate listening to a radio station, almost in a like the KLF sense, but it was a little bit more present. We'll say it was a little bit more present and purposeful in the presentation of some of its songs and themes and its interpolation of guest vocals. And I think when I first listened to this record, because my expectations are so high when I hear new One Oh Tricks Point Never music, and because I had been let down by a couple of his past works, I went through with a fine-tooth comb to try and find anything, any sound, any element of the record that wasn't great, that I wasn't really enjoying, that wasn't doing much for me. But when I peel back and look at this thing as a whole, it is a really interesting sonic experience, and it is among his better albums. I wouldn't call it one of his best albums, given the amazing discography that he's amassed in just, a decade or so. But I really enjoy this thing. I'm enjoying it more and more as I come back to it over and over again, and I just can't wait to see what sort of undertaking he goes on next. I really do think he's one of the most creative and innovative minds working in all of music right now, and I just wish I had realized it, I had seen the forest through the trees, and given him the credit that he deserved when this record came out. And the final album on the list is one that I really should have seen coming. And this one is my fault. More than any of the other ones are my fault. I had rose-colored glasses on when I was reviewing the most recent Grimes album, Miss Anthropocene. I, like many other people, were extremely excited by and intrigued by the thought of a new Grimes album, given that I loved her last two records, particularly Art Angels, so much. But the writing was already on the wall by the time that this record came out, that Grimes was a different kind of person. The living on a raft for a year and only eating spaghetti Grimes was replaced by the, simping for gamer boys, apologizing for billionaires Grimes, and that girl next door feeling that she had really evaporated. It really did, and I thought, whatever happens to her public image, I feel like she's going to come back and the music is still going to be great. She's still going to be Grimes, and the single 4 a.m. really did a lot to make me think, oh yeah, forget all the noise, this is just going to be another great Grimes album. And it's really not. One day I'll have the courage to just end the video right there. But no, it's not terrible, and I even like this record. I think it would make my year-end list if I redid it, but it does waste time. For a short record, there are songs that feel like just a complete dud, just a waste, and pretty much every single thing that Grimes has done since this album came out, just in her personal life as a public celebrity, has simply reinforced the fact to me that I overrated this record, and I feel like I should have known, and I don't know why I didn't. The music hasn't changed here. The album covers changed, and she's released more music since this that was not good at all, way worse than anything on here. I feel like I should have had the intuition to see it, and I didn't, and I will be suffering of my own volition as a result of this for a long time. And that's that. I could probably talk about, 100 albums that I feel differently about over the past, 6 years now that I've been doing this. And I don't want to. It makes me sad. It makes me sad. I wish I had given these albums proper credit, and I wish I hadn't been such a stupid butthead and rated with my heart and not my mind. But that's that. Bunch of new albums coming out. 2022 is getting off to a hot start. There's a ton of great stuff coming out in the first 2 weeks of January and the first 2 weeks of February. So check out the blog, link in the description. Follow the Instagram for updates on when new stuff comes out. And it's going to be a good time. I think the next time I'll do a video will probably be the next episode of Spotlight. I really want to dig into one of my favorite times and genres, 2000s shoegaze, which is a whole mess of underrated, extremely underrated artists and bands and songs. So that's something to look forward to. And that's that.